Bonsoir, Madame, Monsieur. I'm Graham Carr. I'm the Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies here at Concordia University. C'est vraiment un immense plaisir de vous accueillir ce soir and to welcome you to this evening's Thinking Out Loud conversation. First of all, many thanks to our stalwart Alumni Association and to the Globe and Mail for supporting this series, of which Concordia is so very proud. And now, if you've attended some of the previous events in the series, some of the events that were featured in the video that you saw a moment ago, you know that the goal of this series is to feature rich and stimulating conversations on topics that link well to research strengths here at Concordia, but also connect to important issues that all of us face as individuals and as a society. And the format that we've chosen to delve into these topics that matter is a good old-fashioned face-to-face conversation. Well, okay, a moderated face-to-face conversation. Tonight's conversation is about new technologies, self-tracking devices like Fitbit, and also devices that others can track. It's a timely topic. As individuals, we're poised to become walking, talking, big data sets. Who knew that we could be so interesting, let alone so interesting to so many interests? And of course, it's also timely because as the evolving case of Apple, Encryption, and the FBI reveals, there are competing questions around personal privacy and state security that directly or indirectly affect us all. So let's get started, shall we? Please join me in welcoming tonight's moderator, Jared Bland, the Arts and Books Editor of the Globe and Mail. Jared, great to see you again. And our conversationalist this evening, broadcaster and author Nora Young, who many of you will know from Spark, the great radio show she hosts on CBC, and Professor Jeremy Clark from our Concordia Institute for Information Systems Engineering, who works in the areas of cryptography and usable security. So over to them. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you all for coming. We're delighted to be here, and I understand there's inclement weather, so we're extra, I don't know if you've heard about it.
We're grateful.
We're extra appreciative. Okay, before we start, I have a question, a really nitpicky question. Not nitpicky, just curious. Jeremy, what does your Twitter handle mean? We've just seen it broadcast up here for an hour. Pulp Spy.
So first off, you have to know that I chose that internet handle a very long time ago.
You can change it.
I was in high school, and I don't. Once you sort of, establish a sort of identity online, it's nice to not change it. So anyway, I like pulp spy fiction, which is a sort of, And I know I confessed backstage before that I haven't read much fiction recently.
I wasn't going to mention it.
Yeah. In high school, I was really into sort of spy fiction. Like there's the James Bond stuff that's like the highbrow spy fiction, but then there's like Nick Carter and some other like lower brow like pulp stuff, and so I like that. There's also a band called Pulp, and they have a song called I Spy, which I also like. And so it works on multiple levels.
So you're stuck with it for like decades now.
Yeah, exactly. I would change it. I would not choose that today if I was choosing a brand new identity. But
I admire the stick-to-itness, though.
And the interesting thing for me is like my handle is Nora 3000, which I kind of had as a sort of a robot type of name.
It was a joke.
As kind of a joke, but you realize like how this speaks to what we're talking about today. Is like how recent this idea of brand that you have to put out this identity. Like in 2007, it was completely normal to call yourself Pomeranian 99 or Pulp Spy or Nora 3000, right? And now suddenly you have to be like Nora Young branded entity, right?
CBC.
Yeah.
No, it's true. I actually toyed with reactivating my long dormant Facebook account the other day, and I was like, maybe I should start a new one because it's just a terrible scene. And then I realized that I had facebook.com/Jared Bland, and if I deleted it and started a new one, I would be Jared 3000 or some non-cool sounding version of it. It was terrifying to me. I went with the old one. I lasted for a day, quit again. So. We have so much to talk about here tonight, now that we've got our Twitter handles out of the way. But I wanted to start with a thought you've made before, Nora, that I'm really struck by. You said you're interested in tech because of the way in which it can be a lens for us to watch social change. Mm-hmm. And I thought maybe to start, you would each tell us a bit about what you're seeing happening now. I mean, we talked about Apple here just a second ago, and we'll get to that more, I hope. But what are you seeing now? What are the prevailing winds?
I guess for me, the way I look at it, as I've variously been using terms like data boom to talk about this, is what happens when everything around us, when we stop talking about online and offline, and when essentially the world around us is just always already automatically braided through with digital data, whether that's through the stuff that we're generating consciously, but like our status updates and the photos we post on Instagram, or whether that's like the data exhaust that gets produced by all of our internet searches.
What does that mean, data exhaust?
And that means like just the digital breadcrumbs you leave behind as you go about your digital life, as opposed to something that you're consciously intending to share. Or going forward, whether that's the stuff that we ingest, the stuff that we wear, the stuff that we implant, the stuff that's in the environment around us. And that, I think we're going through like actually a really interesting revolutionary moment in data and information. If you think about how long of our society has been characterized by a lack of access to information, and we're now getting ready to go into this world where there's just ubiquitous, constant data gathering about us all the time and about the world around us all the time, which is both fantastic and completely terrifying.
I'm interested in that, though, how long we've been defined by our lack of access to information. Do you just mean because of kind of economic and social structures that have had information held by an elite throughout history or something like that? Or do you mean more recently?
Yeah, but also, I mean, we're like what takes resources to produce, right? If you go back to the Middle Ages, to take a really long view, if you're talking about a book being produced on parchment, that could take, a small herd of cattle or flock of sheep to make a single book, right? That's an extremely resource-intensive use of information. And you compare that to us now, where data and information is just sort of ubiquitous, right? It's like the lights, it's like the water that gets turned on. And I think that is something that is really new.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you talk a lot, too, about the need for curation, because there's so much data now available that it's really hard to kind of sort through all of the clutter, and moving forward, curation is going to be a very important concept. There's probably a lot of money to be made in being sort of a gatekeeper or a curator. But it also, the flip side of it, I guess, is that it's sort of, if you go to your curator for your information, then you're getting a worldview that's consistent with your existing worldview, and so you're not expanding your worldview at the same time.
Yeah, you've remarked on this before, that the data research shows that we tend to curate our own information in a way that goes along with our kind of preconceived notions. Can you give us an example? Like, what does that mean? I've been asked this question a lot tonight. What does that mean?
I guess politics is maybe the easiest thing to cite. I mean, you can go to news organizations, they have certain biases, or they cover certain types of stories, and you'll read about things that conform with your existing political views. Whereas you could get a lot of value from trying to learn about other political views that are very different from your own. Maybe you'll even change your views. So the internet at first, I think, the fact that it enabled you to go out and do that, find competing views, have conversations with people who have different views than you, that seemed like everyone was excited about it, right? But then it didn't really happen. What happened is you just get people sort of siloed off onto sites. You can go on the internet and have conversations, but you're going to talk to people who have largely similar views to you. You're going to read news sources that have similar views. And so you don't get that sort of cross-pollination.
Yeah, and at least, I mean, in an analog era, we might have done that as well, in the sense that we would read newspapers that reflected our biases or whatever. I think the challenge now, and I mean, this is sort of your area more than mine, is that what we're seeing is shaped so much by algorithms that we don't, not only do we not control them, that they're not really transparent to us. We don't know what the biases are that are baked into the algorithms. We don't know what is determining what it is that we see in our newsfeed.
Yeah, and to take it a step further, it could be that the people writing the algorithms don't even understand them themselves.
This came up on Spark. I couldn't believe this.
Yeah.
That the algorithms can be so complex that you can then look back at them and not actually know.
Exactly. So
what it's telling
machines, there's this concept of machine learning where a computer is going to look at some data, it's going to make some inferences, and it will spit out rules about what inferences it made, but you have no way of anchoring that to any sort of reality, right? And they could be spurious. You really have no idea.
I'm sorry, I'm just kind of digesting, digesting that. I mean, is this sort of the anxiety we see? Like, last month or the month before, Twitter announced that they were going to maybe like introduce this algorithm by which things would be sorted. I mean, to what extent are people aware of these algorithms? Like you say, that the people who make them don't even understand them in some cases. But as you point out, these are so pervasive. But do people really intuit this and act accordingly, or what's the right thing to do?
So there is some movement toward what's called accountability, for algorithms, and thinking about how you would make them transparent to at least experts, to look at sort of what inferences are being made. And the two things I would say about algorithms that are concerning to me, one is they make mistakes, right? 6-year-olds end up on a no-fly list because an algorithm made a mistake. And the second thing that you have to remember, too, is that we have algorithms today, right? The algorithms 10 years from now, they're going to blow your mind in terms of what they're able to do. But all the data that we're leaving behind, the digital exhaust that we're leaving behind, is going to be subject to those algorithms in 10 years. It's like the doping scandal in cycling. In this case, they took urine samples that were 10 years old. They used modern techniques, modern tests, and they were able to find all sorts of things, right? And so we're going to subject the data that we're giving out today, it's going to be subjected to the algorithms of the future. And they could be a lot more powerful than even what we see today.
Please.
And I mean,
please.
You got us going on an algorithm rant, so who knows what kind of wormhole we'll get into. But it is that, to me, I think part of the issue there is like, there's the technical issue, but then there's also this cultural issue, which is that we have a lot of blind faith in data, and we have a lot of blind faith that algorithms are neutral and that they're just going to give us the answer and it's going to be unbiased and truthful. But this is something that we've explored on the show, that like first of all, the data that you're drawing from is set by human beings, right? It's unless you're in some way capable of capturing the entirety of the world as it actually exists, you're setting parameters and you're making choices about the kind of data that you collect. And the fact that these algorithms are so influential, I think and that it's mostly uninterrogated about what role that they're playing in our lives, and like not just sort of airy kind of things, like things like what your credit rating is and what kind of a mortgage you get offered, like things that have real, actual, tangible harms.
Well, and is it not fair to say that most of these algorithms are owned by corporations or institutions? I mean, should we assume some sort of profit bias or capitalism bias implicit in them? It's an honest question. I don't know.
So it's certainly the case that companies develop them, and they do own their algorithms in a certain sense. I'm not sure.
I mean, I guess, should we be suspicious of them further for those reasons? Like people love to talk about the Facebook algorithm,
right.
The kind of almighty, powerful Facebook algorithm, which people think of as a benign thing because you don't pay money to Facebook to use its service. But of course, you're offering them a vast buffet of your life. All the things, as you point out, that you don't even realize you're offering, just in terms of how you use the system. I guess those things, I'm always interested in the question of the extent to which we're unaware of how fully surveilled we are, or fully watched we are by these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, algorithms, when we say they need to be neutral or benign, those are two terms. It becomes really tricky defining, what is a neutral algorithm. Mm-hmm. If it is some algorithm that looks at past human behavior to make inferences about relationships between things. Google's been criticized for this sort of things that its algorithms have displayed that were programmed probably in a neutral way, right? But it's sort of reflecting something about human nature that makes it makes it open to criticism. right? And so then they'll go in and they'll override certain things. But then is that a better algorithm? Because there was some human intervention that.
Can I ask just for like a tangible example, if either of you can think of one, of like what that might look like that we might have experienced, those of us who aren't quite as in the world as you are, the tech world, I mean.
So there's one example that I'm thinking of that I actually don't even really want to say.
Okay.
It was really bad. Let's
Okay.
say. Yeah.
That's a very tantalizing way not to tell that story. All right, so
But
yeah.
you mean like there have been cases where something has come up, like where you'll be prompted in your Google search for something that is actually sort of objectionable or suspect?
I was thinking more like say you search Google Images for certain words, and then you get something really racist as a response.
Yeah. This actually happens to me all the time at work. I'll be fact-checking a name or something. Just want to make sure the right photo's running with someone. And if you get the right combination of first and last names, like it can be terrifying.
Right.
In all sorts of senses. Yeah.
But I think, just to return to the algorithm thing and the influence of algorithms, I think, part of the issue when you talk about something like Facebook is that if you're in that proprietary world and the algorithm determines what news you see, it's fine if it's just, okay, did I see that so-and-so got a new job or not? But if you reflect on it as being, that's a proprietary platform with a non-transparent algorithm that's shaping how a lot of people get their news, right? Like, this from your work with the Globe.
Yeah.
Facebook drives an enormous amount of news traffic, right?
We'll frequently see a story where at this point in time where 70 or 80% of all traffic on a story will be from social, and sometimes it'll be 50% of the hundreds of thousands of people who might read a given story, 50% of them come from Facebook.
Yeah, and so that has a lot of implications for things like democracy and how people are being informed about stuff. If that's a proprietary closed system that's shaping whether people saw that news story or not, right? Like there's public import to that kind of thing.
Well, and then just to touch back on this Apple thing that we was raised earlier. It's kind of the flip side of a coin in a way, because it's a private piece of equipment, theoretically private piece of equipment. I wonder if you could just talk about your feelings on this. So, just quickly, I guess, in case you haven't seen it in the news, Apple's refused the Justice Department, I believe's demands to unlock. Please, maybe one of you could do this better than me, actually. And now they got a new court ruling yesterday in a different court case that seems to bolster their belief that they should not have to unlock the phone for the government.
Sure. I'll give you the fact pattern, and then Nora did a good segment on her show last week about it. But the fact pattern is just that there was a phone, it was recovered. It's an older version of the iPhone. It's locked by PIN. Apple has some hardware that's in the phone that if you try and guess what that PIN is, it's going to slow you down. And there's an option to have it that if you guess 10 times you're wrong, it will actually wipe the keys off of the phone, and so the data will be unrecoverable. Probably it's not the case that option is set. It's a non-default setting.
But they don't know.
They don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, and so, my suspicion is that if Apple prevails in this, they probably will attempt then to exhaustively search the PIN space. It probably won't, wipe itself after 10 attempts, and then they'll be able to eventually get in. The dirty secret of 4-digit PINs, we don't know if it was 4-digit. They did say it was a numeric PIN, so 4 digits was the default when he would have been issued the phone. But the dirty secret is that people don't choose random 4-digit PINs.
No.
So there's this graphic that's my most favorite graphic in all of computer science. A friend and colleague made it, Joseph Bonneau, who's at Cambridge. He was at Cambridge, now he's a postdoc at Stanford. And it was a heat map of all the 4-digit pins from a big leaked data set. And so you could see which ones were more common. So obviously like 1, 2, 3, 4, very dark square. But there was all sorts of weird things you could read out of it. You could read the calendar out of it because people would choose month, month, day, day, or they would choose day, day, month, month. And so there would be this dark sort of line where, January went up to 31, and then February went up to 28 or 29, and you could read the calendar out of it. And there's all sorts of math. If you want the digits of pi, it's a really dark square. It's really cool. But anyways, the point is that when they sit down to try and crack this thing, it's not like they have to try every combination. Probably, he's a human being. He chose the password. He probably chose something that's
someone's birth year or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so even if Apple So the other thing Apple does is if you try too many fake or false attempts, then it will slow you down for an hour. It might lock you out for an hour. So they are limited in how fast they can enter these pins. And that's what they want. They don't want Apple to break the encryption. They know that that's not impossible. All they want is Apple to remove the roadblocks so that they can try as many pins as they want as fast as they can using a computer.
Because it would take them 5 minutes then.
Yeah, or less. Like a 4-digit pin, yeah, it would take under a minute.
What did you learn, Nora, in doing your segment on this?
To me, I learned that there are like two ways that we might think about this issue, and I think it's something that's probably is going to come up again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And one way is to think about it as this kind of legal rights kind of frame, which is privacy and security on one hand and public safety on the other hand. But the other way to think about it is as more of a technological question, right? Is it true that creating these kinds of workarounds makes the system less safe for all of us, and less safe in a context where, you're not just talking about hackers, you're talking about activists in repressive regimes.
This is the slippery slope argument.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope argument.
Yeah.
So there are two ways that we could think about it, and in some ways, I don't know that I'm wondering if this might be sort of new, that we are thinking about like a sort of, that it's not just about like the rights-based issues versus public safety issues, that there's actually maybe a technical issue that might be potentially overriding that. What do you think of their statement that this makes everything less secure?
So I think they're making the strongest argument that they can. It's definitely the case that if they produce this exact tool, they can bind it to this one phone in a way that it can. Yeah, in a way that it can't be just used arbitrarily on other phones. Okay? But once they produce the tool, that's 90% of the work. And binding it to this phone is 10% of the work, right? And so all you have to do is circumvent that last 10% in order, if you were able to get this tool, if it leaked, someone has to write it. Those people might leave the company. There's a bunch of ways that this technology may get out. And so once it's built, it may not be the case that you can just go around breaking everyone's phones right away, but 90% of that job is done for you. And so it's just, you have to do one final step in order to apply it to other phones.
I mean, the other thing that came up in our research on this is just the fact that, reminding ourselves that encryption is not something that Google and Apple invented, right? We've had encryption for thousands and thousands of years. That's what the Enigma machine was. It's just that...
What was the Enigma machine? Sorry.
The imitation game thing.
Yeah, I didn't see that one.
So this was a German built...
or learn history,
encryption.
I guess.
Yeah,
the flip side of that.
Right. Nothing to be embarrassed about.
And you can actually see one in Ottawa at the at the museum of, I think it's the military museum, the war museum.
I didn't know that.
They have one of them.
Well, this is quite embarrassing now. So I'll make sure to go look at it.
But the difference being, and this was the point that we made in our research on the show, is that, it used to be that encryption was about certain very specific pieces of information that were, it was spy stuff, right, or whatever, or it was like super powerful elite people stuff. But now it's like, now that all of us have so much digital information, the stakes are just a lot higher and a lot more widespread.
Could this be a kind of line in the sand? One of the things, if you pay attention to internet culture, that you've heard again and again and again from kind of internet activists and privacy activist corners of the web, is that, we have to find a way to make people care. Because people just don't care. A lot of people, at least, don't care. But this seems like, the attention around this case seems to me, at least, like maybe it could be a moment where people realize, okay, wait a minute, this is the practical, it's one thing to ignore your Google search history, but this is a practical thing, like this is my phone. Might there be hope in that for these activists, for privacy activists?
Well, I think some evidence from like the Pew Internet folks suggested that most people support the government side in this. So if you're a privacy advocate, it might not be the result that you'd
But that's
hope
in a
for.
sense because they're playing they're playing a terrorism card. They're making the strongest case they can make, right?
So I think they could make a strong. I mean, I don't think the facts of this case are particularly strong. And they're not stopping a terrorist attack. They're not figuring out who did a terrorist attack. They don't know who that is. They're not even finding evidence to put someone in jail, right? They just are gathering evidence to learn a little bit more about what happened. I think the chief of police in the city said that they don't have high expectations for what they're going to find on this phone. So it is related to terrorism, but I think there could be a much more pressing terrorism case that involves some data on the phone that where getting that data would really, make a difference to the case. And so I think that factors into the balance, right? You do have to balance what utility is the FBI getting from this information versus what they're asking Apple to do, right? And so everyone's focused on the Apple side of the scale, right? Are they asking too much? Is it too onerous? What happens if it gets out? But you can look at the other side of the scale too and ask yourself, well, are you getting enough utility really out of kind of changing the laws surrounding these issues?
But more broadly on the privacy question more generally, I mean, it is something that privacy advocates, bang their head against the wall about, is because the overwhelming reaction that people seem to have is, well, if I'm not doing anything wrong, why do I need to worry? And I think that's why all that stuff about algorithms and stuff is so important, is that, you don't actually know what the actual, you might not actually be seeing the harms, right? You might not actually be seeing that you're not getting the kind of offers from, you're not getting the credit score that you might otherwise get, right? But you don't necessarily know that, right? It's making people see how that's felt in their lives. I think that would be helpful.
Well, and the question of like a phone, I mean, a phone is just one device. And we were talking on the screen earlier about things like Fitbits and things like that, this onerous little thing that insults me every day. And I wonder, Nora, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your more recent research into the so-called Internet of Things, just kind of maybe what that is generally for people who might not have read much about it, and just sort of where that's going. It's kind of astounding, the extent to which these things are becoming involved in our daily lives.
Yeah, so I mean, over the long history of computing, we've seen computers go from these room-sized things to desktops, to laptops, to tablets and cell phones and and getting smaller and smaller and smaller all the time. Such that we carry, powerful computers on our person at all times in our phones. And so what we're starting to see is a move towards more objects in the environment around us that are networked or instrumented, so they're capable. So we can see like lots of little ordinary examples of this, right? You can have, right now in your house, you can have a Why Things bathroom scale that you step on in the morning and it automatically communicates your weight to your online profile, which I guess is a bit
That's
for
your
some
thing.
people. But we're seeing this everywhere, right? Like all these things like sensors in the environment that can track things like air quality, where people are moving, where the city buses are, all this kind of stuff. So what it really is like an explosion of the amount of data gathering that's going. If you think about the kind of data gathering that went on when you're like on your desktop computer, right, doing your Google searches or whatever, to data gathering being kind of ubiquitous in the world around you. And what's kind of interesting and also troublesome is how we get these devices to kind of talk to each other, because that's in some ways the utility of this kind of thing. So if you think about something like the Nest thermostat, which smart thermostat is internet enabled, and it works with the Nest carbon monoxide detector. So they work as a team, and I don't know enough about how this works to actually explain what it is, but it's something like if it detects that there's a fire, it turns off your smoke. I don't know what it did. But anyway, the important thing being that they work together.
Talking. Yeah.
And this is the premise of things like smart homes and smart cities, that you can get these kinds of things that talk together and work together, and the data that's gathered by one of them can help inform the behavior of another one. But on the security and safety tip, there's a ton of stuff that is related to how are we even going to make this work? Like, first of all, there's all these different companies doing this stuff.
Yeah.
How are they going to be? Am I going to be in an environment where, like, not only am I choosing between an Android phone and an Apple phone, I have to choose if I'm going to be like a Google Home or an Apple Home, so that I have all these devices to talk to each other? we have no idea how really the security of these things is going to work. Like one of the things that we talked about on Spark was like, okay, you get your smart fridge, which you're meant to have for whatever 15 or 20 years. And the manufacturer's not going to keep issuing software upgrades for your 10-year-old fridge. Does your old smart fridge now become this like spammy, awful virus trap in the middle of your kitchen? Does it?
So that's definitely what security people are worried about. The software
About the
updates.
fridges.
I mean, it's one of the issues. Well, yeah, I mean, even about fridges. Because once you have a device and it's talking to all the other devices, it's a vector into your now new home network, right? And so malware can spread from device to device, right? So if you can get into one device, then that's a good opportunity to spread. But yeah, Internet of Things, like it's in its infancy, right? And a lot of technologies go through kind of 3 phases. The first phase, you worry a lot about functionality, right? Does this do something useful, right? And then once it does something useful, then people buy it. Then they care about reliability. Reliability is like when Nest, an early version, it crashed. Someone was away on holidays. I think this was in Alberta. It was the winter, and it really did a lot of damage to their home because this thing had crashed, right?
Yeah.
So then you worry about reliability, and then once you have reliability, then you turn your attention to security. Security right now is terrible for a lot of Internet of Things. There's all sorts of drop cameras where there was a search engine that someone created where you could look at all sorts of cameras of people online, or people who in their homes had, a nanny cam set up, pointed at their crib or whatever the case was. It's not even hacking because they put it at a publicly accessible URL, right? So it takes a little work because you have to search for it. You have to sort of exhaustively search for it, but you can find these things. But anyways, computers also were really terrible when they first started being networked in terms of security. Security concerns didn't kill them off, right? We still obviously use computers today. And so, the Internet of Things, the security state, the sad security state of Internet of Things devices right now is sort of a phase, right? They'll get better, and we'll stop worrying about those kind of those like early concerns. But then we're going to turn to the more serious concerns, the longer term concerns, which are the privacy implications of these things.
And isn't there also just like a change of life implication? This is maybe like a Luddite argument, but I was watching CNN before I came over here to watch the Super Tuesday stuff, and there were all these ads for this Internet of Things device that you change your doorbell to. It has a camera, and then if you come to my house and ring the doorbell, I can look at this and see you. To me, this seems like a terrible idea. Like it takes away all the pleasure of not being home and missing those visitors you don't want to come into your house, and then you have this added responsibility of having known they came and having to deal with this information. You did this segment on this fridge, and this guy was talking on your show about the Samsung fridge and how, well, the problem with the Samsung fridge is it's connected to Twitter. So if you don't upgrade your fridge's software, and I understand the fridge that tells you you're out of milk and pings you and tells you need to buy milk. Why is the fridge on Twitter? Philosophically.
I think that's related a lot to what you're saying, right? There's a lot, right now, I think there's a lot of solutions looking for a problem, right? Like we could do all these cool things. You can make a plant that says, water me, but really, isn't it? And like from a philosophical point of view, is it better to always be, like there's this default assumption that it's always better for things to be smarter, and it's always better for you to have a lot of information pushed at you, and it's always better for things to be automated. But I'm not sure that that's, like in the case of the plant that tweets that it's thirsty.
Plants have a way of telling you they're thirsty, they droop. Then you water them.
Maybe it's partly stupid, but maybe it's also like, is there a value in me as a human being learning that I have to pay attention to the things that's going on around me and not just rely on my Twitter feed to tell me that my stupid plant needs to be watered?
The fridge thing was extra interesting because the way he made it sound, at least, and I'm not up on these tweeting fridges, but was that it's not that it has its own account, it's that it has access to your account. So presumably like broadcast embarrassing information about the state of your fridge to your followers. Would you like to mount a defense of the needless Internet of Things?
You have to read the terms of service, right?
Oh. And as you pointed out recently, there was a survey where it's something like you would spend 24 hours a year reading terms of service agreements if you actually read them.
Right. So that was, some Carnegie Mellon people, Lori Craner and a colleague.
Actually read them.
They did a back of the envelope sort of with a lot of assumptions, but they didn't actually read every terms of service and self-measure how long it took them, although that would be a better experiment, I think.
But you strike me as someone who does read them.
I don't. Nobody does, but I skim them sometimes. I look for interesting things. But.
And we're moving toward these things becoming even more entrenched in our lives. Like I joke about the fridge, but this technology of a Fitbit is obsolete essentially at this point because people who are really elite athletes or that are buying shirts that do this for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where do you see this going beyond just more and more? Do you see this taking any particular direction?
I see it becoming more and more ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Like I learned about this thing recently. It's a tech company called Proteus. They make medications that have a tiny sensor about the size of a grain of sand on them. And so when you take your medication, as it starts to dissolve, it communicates information to a little thing that you're wearing on your lapel, indicating that you've taken the time that you've taken your medication. And also a couple of other things like what your heart rate is or something or other. And then it communicates that to your app, right? And you can imagine, like, if that's happening in 2016, like what does 5 years from now look like? You can imagine a scenario where virtually everything about you is tracked all the time. And I mean, the promise of that is, first of all, that you might be able to have something like way more personalized healthcare and a way better sense of what's going on with your body than by going to your doctor once a year.
Yeah.
And in turn, at the global level, and this is the more important thing, is that in the aggregate, all of that data can actually tell us some really interesting things about people's health in general that we can use for really positive benefits. But the negative side of that, obviously, is if we're having these problems with, algorithms shaping what my credit score is or whatever based on these points of data, what happens when we have this very, very rich set? And when we have like a whole privacy regime that was basically set up to protect small amounts of very important data, right? Like your social insurance number and things like that, and not large amounts of seemingly trivial data that who knows what you might be able to do with when it's all together. That's where I think it's going.
And we are seeing a sort of creep of data that's already been collected, like a Fitbit is an example where there's insurance claims. People say that I'm disabled, I want disability insurance, and then they might submit their Fitbit data to show that they're actually less mobile than they were before the incident.
That is the flip side of that as well.
Exactly. So you can imagine if they were able to query that data themselves to determine whether or not you were, like in this case, they're voluntarily disclosing it.
Yeah.
The insurance companies don't have the power to just request that information. But you can imagine a world, where your car can tattle on you every time you speed or run a red light, right? You could get a ticket in the mail, fully automated. A human being didn't even touch it.
Because your car just
a computer
ratted you
printed
out.
it out. Yeah. Maybe someone walked the envelope over to the mailbox, but aside from that.
That's the thing, and we don't know what is going to be the regime that governs that, right?
Yeah.
Like right now, it's the case that you can say to your insurance company, yes, I agree to have this like dongle in my car or whatever thing on my dashboard to monitor my driving, and you can get a break on your insurance.
Really? I don't have a car, so I don't know stuff
No,
about
that
cars.
exists right now.
Wow.
Yeah, and if you don't install it, you don't get the break on your insurance. So then you have to ask yourself, well, if your insurance can only go down, like presumably if you got the dongle and you're a terrible driver and your insurance goes up, you'll just turn the dongle off, right? And so there's no way that the insurance companies are only lowering some people's insurance and keeping everyone else at the same level. So that it's the fact that if you don't have the dongle, your insurance rates are going up.
You're going to get hit.
Or they're at least holding them at the same level, whereas they would go down otherwise.
Yeah, or at least de facto, there's in essence a penalty for not agreeing to be surveilled, right? Yeah.
Maybe this is just the romantic liberal arts person in me, but like, isn't there something to be said for like the elements that make a person that can't be quantified? Or do we no longer believe that there are such things?
That's a very liberal arts question.
Yeah, sorry.
You could see his level of comfort with liberal arts.
Well, I was thinking that scene. I was rewatching Breaking Bad, and there's that really cheesy flashback scene in the first season where Walt, as a young man, when he was a science genius, is doing formulas on the blackboard, and they're trying to figure out like how much. I don't know, chemical stuff goes into a brain, and they can't quite get the numbers to work out. And then someone's like, well, that must be the soul. But do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, you can have this quantified life, but at some point, what's untraceable?
Well, I mean, I think, and you'll excuse me while I have a halls, I have this
Please do.
kennel cough that's been going around CBC recently. I mean, that I think is something I wrote about in the book, is that, once you start to set a lot of value around things that can be quantified, the danger is that which can't be quantified falls off the table, right? And you also have to think about what are the, who's setting what you're quantifying.
Yeah.
So not to, kick Facebook in particular, but it's a handy example. So, if you really wanted to say what describes who I am as a human being, would you really say that it's where you went to school and what your favorite bands are and all of that stuff that you're prompted to list on your Facebook profile? Like, no, it's because it's good at, that's a thing that is good at being listy, which is the thing that digital does well. And it's a thing that is good at producing, psychographic marketing profiles for people, right? So there's a question of who is asking what things should be quantified and why? Why is there this presumption that we all ought to be these performative, healthy, fit, going to bed on time, getting a good night's sleep people? That's always seems to be baked into a lot of these quantified self tools. So I think it's a completely
You should get
valid
more
question.
sleep. That one I'm a big believer in. Yeah. But I mean,
I love sleep technology, and you cover it a lot on Spark.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say if I was in a cryptographer, I would be like a sleep scientist, because I just
Really?
love that stuff.
It's not too late. You can go to Concordia probably. To
Yeah,
study
exactly.
that.
Apparently we have free tuition to take courses.
But I mean, does this ever cross your mind, or is this really honestly such a kind of an artsy anxiety that it wouldn't enter your head?
No, I mean, I try, in my research, I actually try and have I try and think about things all the way down to the human. So
That's big of you.
Which isn't always the case in computer science.
Yeah.
And so I certainly focus sort of on usability and that type of thing, which isn't related to your question. But so there are. Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with Nora that it's, technology is good at tracking certain things, and so it's going to track the things that it's good at. Facebook is good at asking certain kinds of questions, so that's what it's going to ask it, right? It asks about your favorite band because then it can link in, iTunes ads, and you can buy music. Everyone's obsessed with your income, right? Not because it's not something that defines you, but it's the most useful data point.
Well, to sell an advertisement.
Yeah, to sell for advertisements, or to just use it in general to say something about their the population of people that use the websites. And so the other thing too is I think we have the ability to be selective about what we use in terms of tracking, self-tracking, and also in terms of Internet of Things, like what types of devices and stuff we use. And I think that when cell phones first came out, everyone was installing all sorts of apps. There were apps that would do all sorts of things, right? And everyone was excited, and you were trying out things just because they were new, and it was really cool that you could get an app to do this or an app to do that. But now I know that, I've gone through my phone and deleted, 90% of all the apps I've installed in the lifetime of my phone. I probably only have 10% of them because they're actually useful. Mm-hmm. So I think you will see tracking or Internet of Things, you will see it become more ubiquitous, but I think you'll see it become more focused as well on things that are actually useful. I think if it's your plant that, is tweeting that it needs water, if that's not really useful to you, it's fun, it's a gadget, for 6 months, it's fun to show your friends, but then after a while you just stop using it.
But you keep using Uber or whatever because you use it twice a week.
Yeah, precisely, yeah. Unless if you're coming from the airport here in Montreal, then they won't pick you up.
I did not know that.
Yes, yes. That's a Montreal specific thing.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, just also that I think, just to your point about the utility of these things, is once you start to see, it's not just an app that kind of passively gathers data or does something useful for you, but once you get into a kind of a feedback loop with some of these services, I think you can start to see them being more authentically useful. So just to use an example, the music service Spotify has been experimenting with this thing where basically if you use it for your run, what it'll do is gather data about things like your heart rate and stuff, and then change the music that's fed to you based on
To match the tempo
what your
to
heart
your-
rate is.
yeah.
So, I mean, that may be useful, that may not be useful, but I think that's the kind of thing, like if I were going to point to a kind of technology that's incipient technology that we'll see a lot more of, it's that kind of thing where it's responding to how you're behaving and supporting you in that kind of behavior.
Yes, I think that's really interesting, like the sort of connection between apps. That's something that just wasn't possible until now. So now that we have all the self-tracking, thinking about how these devices communicate to each other and how, something can be, the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts in the sense that, you have a heart rate monitor, you have Spotify, but in this case, integrating them. And you spoke earlier, Nora, about the, sort of the open protocols, like, are we going to see a bunch of silos where there's Apple stuff that doesn't talk to Google stuff, or are we going to see open protocols, sort of like the internet, where these devices follow, standards, and so they know how to communicate to each other, and so that's a lot of work for, I guess, us as computer sciences to do in the future, is develop these standards so that we can have these open interfaces so these devices can talk to each other.
It does seem like that's getting better, I think, just as a layperson using these things.
Yeah, the funny thing is that behind all these standards, there's a huge political process. There's people, someone has to write the standards, you have to have industry sign on to use the standards. And it's hard to say it's getting better. It's, there's a whole world, I guess, behind like these standards that you don't really see until you sort of get into that space. But it's just like any other human enterprise, right? There's lots of egos at work and a lot of competing interests.
But do you think that's going to happen? Because that, to me, is one of the things that I think is, that's the path by which a more generative, creative ecosystem of stuff happens, is if there's a common framework, but you can have many, many, many different creators, rather than saying, okay, we'll just turn everything over to Google and let them.
Right. I think my best guess is that both will happen. There'll be companies that will have their closed standards that won't interface with other things. There will be open standards, and there'll be a lot of people that come in and build devices that comply to it. And then it's really just going to come down to the consumer. Does the consumer want to live in the, I'm going to pick on Apple because they're very like sort of closed in their ecosystem. Do you want to live in sort of the Apple world where all your devices talk to each other, they interface really well, but they don't really talk to the rest of the world? Or do you want to live in the more open, maybe Android world? And you see that with cell phones, like there was this open handset alliance, where everything was going to be like open, and there are phones that comply with it, and then there's phones that don't, and it's really up to consumers to decide what they want to buy.
I guess what I meant is, like, today I opened a Word document on my MacBook and it just worked. Like, whereas 5 years ago it would have freaked out on me. And like, there does seem to be, at least for the everyday consumer, some loosening of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I agree. But then try and open that Word doc in Google Docs, or try and open it in Open Office. That's where you could start.
Oh, I did open
problems.
it in Open Office. That's what I mean. Anyway, yeah. So this is just a kind of a last question here before we turn to audience questions. I don't know how into this you are, but we just started backstage talking about driverless cars and car security in general. And I learned on your show that you can hack a car and theoretically do something very bad and drive someone into a tree or something. You say this is happening now? Not happening, but it could happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like there's proof of concept. People have done it. They've got research grants to buy a brand new car. And they hacked it, and so you could do all sorts of things. A lot of them involve an in-person attack. So I have to have physical access to your car. One One of the favorite ones, and I hope I get the details right because this is going to be on YouTube forever, and if it's wrong, it's going to be embarrassing.
They can issue a correction.
I think what they did is they put a CD in, and it played as sort of audio, and then the voice recognition system was interpreting that audio, and that was the vector that they used to sort of corrupt that component, and then they were able to corrupt like the whole car.
And did James Bond have to put the CD in himself to
Yeah,
make this
yeah,
happen?
something
Or
like
it's just like, it's incredible. So, okay, your best prediction then for the driverless car future from both of you. Is this going to happen? We spend a lot of time being anxious about this at work for some reason. It's like a pet hobby of ours. Like, we're very afraid of driverless cars. Do you think?
I mean, as a person who doesn't, I don't drive, so
Yeah.
to me it's like that seems
They're all driverless.
awesome, right? Like, that would be great. I mean, I think that there's a lot of stuff around the ethics
Yeah.
and the fact that human ethics around right and wrong. As far as I understand, some of the stuff that we've done on Spark about this is that human ethics are not always quite so cut and dried or consistent. They're weird, fuzzy things. And it's an interesting question to see how do we encode those ethics into driverless cars, right? Is it always the case that it's better to kill the person who's older rather than the child? Is it always the case that it's better to, kill more people than fewer people if your car is out of control or whatever? Like, I don't know how you would do that in a way that's like the same kind of fuzzy
Messy.
moral thinking
Yeah.
that human beings do.
I think that's why it's so fascinating to people, though, just that dilemma.
Right, and you do have to recognize that a computer can't tell whether that person walked in front of your car on purpose or not. Probably, right? And so that's the security person in me thinking about it. But if I know that if I get 5 of my friends and we all jump out in front of a car, it's going to kill the driver as opposed to killing me and my 5 friends because it thinks one life is worth, less than 6 lives. Right? There's going to be some episode of CSI where that's the plot twist. Where 6 people, jump in front of a car to kill the person and then they walk off and no one knows who did it.
It's very devious with these schemes of yours.
Yeah. But, it is happening. I mean, there is driverless technology that won't do everything for you, but now there's lane assist and there are these technologies in higher end cars that you can buy a car today that will park itself. It will parallel park itself. And so this technology is already there. And so I think it is coming. I think it's going to creep in slowly. So certain functions will take over. You're in stop and go traffic, then that's fine. You can turn off on the driverless mode. Or you're parking, you can turn it on, right? And eventually, you'll have it on all the time.
Although apparently one of the things that driverless cars, autonomous vehicles, have trouble with is, apparently you're supposed to say autonomous vehicles, is when there's snow-covered roads because they have trouble figuring out where the lanes are. So you wouldn't be using it in Montreal on the night of a blizzard, for example.
Oh my God, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
I was recently in a car for the first time in 6 months and driving one, and I was shocked to discover that they have a rear-mounted camera and you can watch yourself back up. That's where I'm at car-wise with the autonomous car. Okay, so one last question before we go to audience questions. I hope you have lots of them. I'm sure you do. But it was just, I was thinking about what you said about how you delete all those useless apps, because every now and then I'll be in my iTunes, which stores that record of your idiocy, and you're like, really, Angry Birds, Once Upon a Time. What is your favorite app? What is your most useful app? Your recommendation for the audience? A service journalism question here to end.
Nora, please.
Yeah, you both have.
My favorite app is called Workflowy. It's a productivity app. It's very open-ended, and it's synced across, your browser, wherever you want to use it, and the app. And it's very, very simple, and I love it. It's just like you just tap it and you poke work, personal, Spark, other CBC, other outside project, and you just add it does that thing that software does when you go when it's just simple and open-ended, and it doesn't distract you, it doesn't send you stupid notifications.
Workflowy.
Workflowy, yes.
I don't really have a good answer for you. Most of the apps I use are the sort of boring standard apps that come with the phone. I feel like the answer I should give you is Slack, because that's the most useful kind of third-party app that I use. I use it to manage my grad students' And so we have, every research topic that we're looking into, we have a Slack channel set up. Yeah. We can chat. I like it because it lowers the bar for interaction. So, emailing a professor can sometimes be a little intimidating. You want to make sure you have something good, before you email them.
Yeah.
But on Slack, you can just ask a quick question, a dumb question, if you will. And yeah, there isn't that barrier to entry.
Yeah, it's transforming our newsroom. We all use it for that. Not that anyone asked, but mine, a recent discovery. This is the real reason I asked this question. You might have read about it in the New York Times last week. It's a Japanese, it's not a game. People say it's a game. I think of it as like a plane of being. It's called Nico Atsume, and it is which translates loosely to kitty collector. And it's a game in which you have this digital yard and cats come and visit. Oh, yeah. And you leave them food and they leave you the currency of the realm, which is silverfish and goldfish. And that's it. It's like this whole beautiful universe that just exists. And you pop in and come there, so anyway, my mother is very addicted now. And I think you will like it.
So in 5 years, will it still be on your phone?
I've been doing it for months. You just look in, it's very calming. Turn the sound off, you can do it in meetings at work, Very useful. Hope no Globe people are watching. So we're going to take audience questions here, if we can get the house lights raised, maybe. Or it'll be mystery questions. Great. Yes, here on the right.
Okay. Theoretically, improved technology is supposed to enhance our ability to know and do things. But the reverse seems to be happening. It would appear that technology is being used to use us as victims or customers to satisfy some other interest. And so the question becomes, what kind of identity do we have in our society? Are we simply ciphers to be moved around in the interests of various corporate or other interests? Or are we supposedly critical thinking members who can understand and change society as it evolves? I'm not sure of the answer to that question. Mm-hmm.
Please.
Well, there's the saying that's now become sort of a cliche where they say, if you're not the product, what is it again? If you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. And so that sort of speaks to, I think, what your concern is. In my view, I mean, there is a trade-off, right? You are giving a lot of your personal data out that can be chopped up. You can run algorithms on it. You can sell information that's based on it. And so you are a commodity at that point, but you wouldn't be using Facebook if it didn't also give you some sort of utility, right? And so I think that maybe we don't fully understand that transaction, that all the privacy that we're giving away for what Facebook gives us, not to just pick on Facebook, but that's a convenient example. But yeah, it certainly is the case that we as users are being commoditized online.
Yeah, and it's certainly, we have gone through this kind of shift where, we have a very different relationship to some of these technologies than we do traditionally with our analog tools, right? I mean, I was thinking about this a while ago when I was using my pasta machine at home, that this is I was thinking, this is crazy. I bought this thing for whatever, $100 or something. You have it, it lasts for like 20 years.
Yeah.
What kind of a business model is that? But this is how quickly we've moved from saying
3 years later.
It should be tying me with all kinds of software that I have to upgrade and because we've moved into this very different world with respect to our tools of buying something that is a discrete object that we have a relationship with, that we form a level of competency with, more or less. To this situation where we have this tied relationship to our devices, where they are inherently always gathering data about us, and which I agree does put us in some sense
in a more passive situation. If I may just quickly follow up, I went to a conference recently talking about future technology, where someone entertained the idea that there are people working on the idea of implanting chips in our brains so that we can then be communicated with at will by other people who get in touch with our chips. What does that say about our identity?
What's wrong with that? I don't know. I mean, if you want that chip and you want to be communicated with in that way, I don't see a problem with
But
that.
how would you not be manipulated at the same time?
Right. So I think you would have to understand, and we really don't do a good job of this, is understand the implications of the technologies that we choose to use, right? And so if that chip were capable of manipulating your brain, and you understood that, you probably would never, accept for that to happen to you. But if it were miscommunicated to you, which is, I think, sort of the world that we live in terms of our privacy, or you don't understand what that technology could do, then you certainly may regret that decision.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go over here.
Hi, my question has to do specifically with two kind of events that happen, having to do with how these experiments are kind of being conducted by these private companies. One of them is the Uber right of shame, which is basically they used an algorithm to tell, I think it was after New Year's, how many people had one-night stands based on their patterns of going back home from addresses that weren't theirs the night before and so on. There's something comparable with Facebook where they altered people's news feed using kind of separating kind of portions of control groups and then just doing slight altercations to news feeds and gauging people's reactions by how they were clicking and how they were, what the tone of their posts were afterwards. And these kind of seem like grand scale social experiments, which don't seem to be under the scrutiny of ethical review in any kind of form or fashion. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and what kind of how we should be looking at maybe enforcing some kind of ethical review of what these private companies are doing with their platforms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really important question, and I mean, I think part of it lies simply, I think, in the pushback, right? Like in the case of the Facebook thing, there was a lot of negative feedback, and so they were forced to kind of stand down on it. So in some ways, I think people's public reaction does play a role. Although, it's interesting, right around the time that happened, one of the guys from the dating site OkCupid said, I don't know what everyone's getting so upset about. We're manipulating, anytime you go to websites, it's being manipulated all the time dynamically because, again, as came up with this other gentleman, it's part of the affordances of digital that we have this feedback loop of how our technologies are being used in a way that we never had before with a paper newspaper or whatever.
But newspapers do it too now. I mean, we always do A/B testing on headlines where you'll run a version in one market even geographically. Yeah. I mean,
everyone does it, yeah.
Cutting in and out, sorry.
Yeah, but your question is whether there should be some sort of code of ethics or formal regulations.
So at universities, we do have ethical reviews, and I think it would be very useful. And at Facebook, the people who did this experiment, it's easy to think of Facebook as a person, right? It's not a person, it's a collection of people. And the people who did this experiment were sort of on the research side of the Facebook team, and that's basically their job. They do all sorts of A/B testing on all sorts of different things. This one kind of crossed the line. Right, but there's 100 other experiments that they run that didn't necessarily cross the line. And so I think for Facebook to come in and implement some sort of ethical review board that they have to get clearance from, I think that would be, a really good idea. And it'd be nice to see other companies like Uber and other companies also to do that. Yeah.
We'll go to this side.
Hi. So my question is about the workday and thinking about labor and leisure time. And I was just thinking with the example of the autonomous car, thinking around that and how things like phones that are closer to our body and personal have been a way of kind of breaking down the workday versus leisure time, and how people can always be on their phones. We've talked about it all the time. But then how things like driverless cars are breaking this down even further, where people who used to commute for an hour into work and sit in traffic can now be working on their phones. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that moving forward, and this even further dissolution of having free time or personal time or time. I guess driving's not necessarily that, but this disillusion.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I hadn't thought about it.
The terrifying eroding boundary.
With respect to the driverless cars. I mean, I think you know, I think in terms of technology design, in a way, I think there is a bit of a movement in technology design towards calm technologies and towards getting better at, you know, getting away from the constant pinging and notification and the constant siren song of intermittent reinforcement that kind of pulls us into checking our work emails when we should be saying that we're like away from the office. But I think, I don't know if that feels like maybe an inevitable slide, that those worlds are not going to be completely separate. And you know, maybe in some ways that's a return to an older way of life when, you know, work life was not actually as separate from personal life. Although the idea of, you know, the part of me that thinks like, am I really going to have to answer emails at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night is creeped out by that. That's a terrible answer to a very good point.
Yeah, but I think the one thing that really has changed is the people's expectations of the reachability of you, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you can always use the excuse, oh, I was driving, right? And so if that excuse goes away, you know, that's one more, you know, area of life that infringes on.
I think you're really onto something. We should start a movement to encourage any driverless car time to be leisure time, demarcated for, you know, listening to podcasts or whatever. Okay, so we have like 5 or 10 minutes left for questions. So we have 4 people to ask them. So if you can be relatively quick, we'll try to get through them all here. Thanks. On this side.
Do you think cryptographic research will ever become as entangled to politics as, say, climate science or evolution? You know, maybe it already is.
Can you define that term first?
Maybe in the future, politician will run on the platform of, you know, I am against cryptography and on its forms.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, well, first, hi, Dan.
And
My student.
Ringer.
I asked them to ask that question.
A plant!
Yeah, you know, I can't see, okay, could it become a public policy question? Yes, absolutely. It has already. I mean, Donald Trump has weighed in on the FBI versus Apple case. If you go back to the 90s, there was this thing called the Clipper chip. And, you know, I'll save you the details of it, but basically it was the cryptographers versus the government, and people took sides. And eventually it was resolved, sort of the cryptographers won that battle, but there were political lines that were drawn. Will it ever be to the same scale as sort of climate change or, I forget the other issue you mentioned, but I don't think so. I mean, you know, I think there are public policy questions that will be asked, but I don't think it will ever become that sort of integral to the political process.
I'd like to point out that it's nice that you had to ask a human to come ask the question for you.
Oh, yes.
You know, there's no way around that cheat.
Exactly.
That's not true. I asked this question of my own free will.
Yeah, we'll go to this side.
Hello. My question is, do you think there is a reason why technology is better at solving certain issues over others? To be more specific, we've been talking a lot about entertainment, WhatsApp, our cell phones, and so on, but you have other problems, like you have famine, you have wars. Do you think there is a reason why technology is better at solving problems like how can I solve being bored by having Angry Birds, rather than maybe, how can we devise something that would probably enable detection of IEDs better? Do you think there is a reason why technology is actually better at solving certain issues than others in this specific case?
Well, I think one set of technological problems are the kinds of technological problems that attract venture capital, and the other kind are not the kind that attract venture capital.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what I was going to say too, is, you know, you're paying for technology, right? And so as long as people pay to not be bored, and they value that over, you know, solving famine or whatever the other issues are, then companies will produce the technology that people want to consume. And if you look at, you know, who funds that other type, like useful technology that's actually useful for solving, you know, sort of global scale issues, it's not the same people that are developing Angry Birds, right? They may be as rich, but it's usually being funneled through government, or there's some sort of funding organizations. There's a lot of bureaucracy that you just don't get in Silicon Valley, for example. And so I think a lot of it gets tied up in bureaucracy. You may need to get governments on board. That can drag a project down. And so I think the sort of, I think bureaucracy is a major deterrent to at least developing that technology in a time scale that would be as fast as people can pump out, cell phone apps.
And then I think there's also the question of like, what is a strictly technical problem, and what is a problem that maybe has technical aspects to it, but also involves a certain amount of like political will, moral will, ethical consensus, which are not strictly speaking technical questions, right?
Thank you. Our second to last question.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk that was basically about agency, social agency that we have, the capacity to act, right? So do you have any hope in terms of the Mako movement, Fab Labs, Living Labs, the Raspberry Pi, like ways for people to actually act on those issues, to really build the technology themselves?
I think those movements have a certain amount of traction, undoubtedly. And I've seen too many movements like that become sort of a minority, within technology. We spoke earlier about open standards for things, and that's sort of in line with that. And so I guess I'm kind of pessimistic just based on the track record of other movements like that, and they don't ever seem to sort of take over the mainstream. I would love for it to happen, but I just have to be a little skeptical, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that part of, like, I wouldn't be able to do the job I did if I didn't think there was a value in asking critical questions about technology and engaging with those questions. And I think that what's called, critical making, not just critical thinking, is part of that too. It's part of consciousness raising, if you will. How far it can go, is it like, that's a really interesting question. Could that really become a thing that is widely practiced? I also would like to see that happen.
Thanks. May I just say that's the greatest sweater I've seen all year.
My mom made it. My mom made it.
Your mother made it?
Yeah.
Please,
Nice.
it's unbelievable. I wish I could take it off you. It would be too small. Our last question.
Good evening, and thank you for interesting thoughts. Some of them were Internet of Things, and the other one was having a medical device which is transmitting data to your cell phone and stuff like that, and then chip in the brain. And all this involves a lot of personal information, like DNA and our thoughts and our personal biometric data, which are transferred into certain, let's say, internet space, which is accessible to everybody. And in the past, I've seen a number of movies which were basically saying the same things that we are living today. And this is the government is accessing all this information and using it for its personal, not to say personal, but for its own purposes. And that then there are some other people who are not, let's say, well-meaning and who are hacking into those information. And in the light of all of this, I'm interested in finding out who in this room, it's a quick survey, would be willing today to take a brain chip or any kind of a device which would transmit biometric data and thoughts, everything else.
Thoughts?
Yeah.
I might do the biometric part. I don't know.
Well, if we have a chip in the brain which is communicating with other chips in the brain and we have no need for oral communication, then it involves thoughts, right?
So it's actually not as crazy.
This gentleman here first said, why not brain chip?
Yeah.
Are you willing today to put this brain chip into your brain?
He has one for you.
Yeah, I don't think I would be willing.
I'm not taking it.
But we did see there was some interesting research about trying to remember the details, but there's some gaming systems that have these sort of, you can control like the game based on your brain waves. And what they were able to do, the researchers, these are security people, my people, and they, so what they would do is they would flash sort of subliminal things on the screen relating to your password, and you just can't help but either recognize or not recognize it if it conforms to your password or not. And so they were able to actually just leak, they could pull your password out. You didn't even know it happened because you had this thing hooked up to your brain. And so that's, it's not as far-fetched, I guess, as maybe it seems. But
yeah, I think with a lot of these things, we frame it as utility, right? Is there a utility to it? And there are always utilities to it. But I guess there's the other side of it is this question of like, at what point do you stop? Like you say, this is too intimate. This is too close to me, right? I'm all right with the apps on my phone. I'm all right with the wearable thing. I'm all right with the pill that knows when I've taken the pill, but I'm not all right with something like constantly having a 24-hour access to my, is it your EEG? Whatever your...
Yeah, you look at me like I know, which is really funny.
EEG, yeah.
Like, where's the line in the sand? Would you do it?
Nope, never. No. There is an old movie which has Ministry of Information, which gathers all this data. And ultimately in the movie, the Ministry of Information, just like NSA today, is abusing this data to control all the people. And there are a few guys in the movie who are trying to fight against it, but we saw what happened to Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. And I didn't get an answer. Will you have a brain chip?
No. So not at this point. I mean, there's no compelling story right now that you could tell me about why I would need that I would implant it. I'm not saying that I'll never do it.
Well, I would never do it. I was just questioning you. You said, why wouldn't you have it just a moment ago before the questions? Now you're saying I wouldn't have it.
Yeah, no, I was just pushing back
contradictory.
on the assumption that it was necessarily inherently, evil that you might do that. We talk about implantable technology. So the brain chip is one example. And the other thing is, it's sort of science fiction to think that, if you have something that you're going to implant that allows you to hear messages, that somehow that's going to, read your thoughts or something like that. The brain's quite complicated, and so there is a sort of isolation of tasks that would take place where you could implant things that aren't going to take over. You're not going to become a zombie or like a remote control human because you have some implantable technology. But back to your point about the consolidation of data, that is very concerning, right? Companies are consolidating lots of data. Once they have it consolidated, governments can access it through the legal system. Hackers, as you mentioned, can access it. Companies eventually are going to go out of business, right? Nowadays, companies go out of business, they get rated for their intellectual property, right? All their patents and that type of thing. I think in 5 or 10 years, companies like even the giants like Facebook, they may not be doing so well financially, and they're going to get rated for all the personal data that they've collected. And you may think that, oh, this company's, I trust them, they're not evil. I like this company, I'm willing to share my data, but you have no idea where that data is going to end up.
Yeah. I'm getting the hard out of time signal here. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I just want to thank Jeremy and Nora, and thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to be back here at Concordia doing this. And Nora's going to sign books out there. So if you have any further questions, you can ask her while she signs your recently purchased copy of her book. Thank you all so much.